There's a separate timeline in some universe where George Miller's Justice League Mortal got made in the Australian desert in 2007. And Adam Brody was the Flash, and Armie Hammer was Batman, and spent the last decade and a half freely eating human flesh as much as he wanted while DC's film universe took off before Marvel's. Zack Snyder was never at the helm of the DCEU, and everyone loves DC movies. And it seems, in a way, like the Flash is trying to occupy two separate timelines as well. One in which the previous 15 years of DC missteps never took place, and also one in which it draws on their remaining appeal before an inevitable reset. The Flash is a strangely okay and pretty entertaining film, while feeling like there's no stakes that exist whatsoever. It's surprisingly fun, but nothing that happens, including Michael Keaton returning as Batman, feels like it matters at all, and the film makes sure that you get that. I'm Dan Umphin, and this is the Doomcast. First of all, do me a favor, hit subscribe and the bell. I make about one of these videos a week. They're all great, so please don't miss even one. Also, there are plenty of spoilers that are coming up, so if you weren't one of the people that spent $55 million, only $55 million domestically, to purchase a ticket to The Flash this last weekend, then maybe wait until you see it if you want to, if you care. Which, despite most of DC sucking lately, now or for a while, you might consider seeing it. It is dumb fun, and I give it a 6.5 to 7 out of 10. Unlike Ant-Man, which was just bland and dumb, in my opinion, this was very silly, but also the humor worked and treated very few parts of the plot as thoroughly serious outside of the subject of Nora Allen's murder. It opens with babies, specifically a maternity ward full of babies falling from a window alongside a nurse and a therapy dog. An emergency which Flash runs to in his new, sleeker, and better-looking costume while stealing food, and microwaving burritos and almost microwaving babies along the way. By the way, the third episode of the Doomcast 6 years ago actually accurately calculated the total amount of calories that the Flash would have to eat in order to make a cross-country run. You should check it out here. A full disclosure, I don't have a dog in the Snyder fanboy versus Gunn fanboy fight at all, but I am a DC fanboy. I do think that Gardner Fox and Carmine Infantino deserve at least equal credit that Stan Lee and Jack Kirby frequently get. That aside, this is a rough adaptation of the 2010 Jeff Johns comic storyline Flashpoint. It is not a thorough adaptation at all. In that comic story, Barry attempts to prevent his mother's murder at the hands of the Reverse Flash, Eobard Thawne, which was revenge for ruining Eobard Thawne's life in the 25th century, but he succeeds and finds himself in a world where he is depowered. Superman is in a cage in a federal black site and depowered. Batman's dad ended up becoming Batman, and he loves guns now, huge 2A guy. And Shazam is like 6 kids. Wonder Woman and Aquaman are both fascists and at war, and shit generally sucks. When he fixes it, the entirety of DC's comic timeline was reset into the New 52, of which there were some notably very good comics that started off that got canceled within like 8 issues. One of them was Demon Knights, and it frickin' ruled. You can check out a video about that here also. Almost everybody in the Justice League has a weird cameo, including Wonder Woman, whose theme music is absolutely the worst grindy guitar garbage. Also Batfleck, who looks like a literal Frank Miller drawing in both good and bad ways. Notably, Ray Fisher is entirely missing. Barry realizes that to prevent the murder of his mother, he needs to go shake hands with Naoto and go back 12 years to befriend members of the Tokyo Manji gang to prevent Hinata from... Hang on, that's actually Tokyo Revengers. Barry needs to go back in time to prevent his mom Nora's murder after he realizes that he can step into what he calls the Chrono Bowl, a sort of temporal liminal space where everything has PlayStation 2 cutscene graphics. He decides the best way to do this is to move a can of organic tomatoes into her cart, a thing impossible to get in 2003, instead of solving her actual murder like he did in the comic, which, by the way, if you're wondering, no one ever really bothers with that in this film. Not at all. Also, his mom is randomly a Spaniard. Not Mexican, she's speaking continental Spanish and is played by a Spanish woman who is cooking spaghetti, which it would be hilarious instead if Barry Allen was half Italian. Hey, Ma, I gotta get somewhere, come on. Anyway, His mom doesn't die, but instead he finds himself face to face with his super dipshit 18-year-old self in his parents' house after getting punched out of the time bowl by some Flash-like monster. Who could that be? Realizing he needs to get himself powers, he brings younger Barry to the crime lab where he succeeds in giving younger Barry powers, but in turn loses his. They then meet young Barry's roommates in that universe, discuss that Eric Stoltz is in Back to the Future in this universe, which has become a pretty common time travel trope as well. Marty McFly was a pretty funny joke, but other than that, they decide to seek out their universe's Batman. They end up in Wayne Manor and find Alan Moore cooking spaghetti on his own when he drops an ass whooping on both of them, and then after hearing them out, promptly declines to help them. Then the Barrys break into their Batcave just for the computer to find out where their universe's Superman is, and just like the Flashpoint comic, discover that Superman is being held in a secret facility and likely depowered. Batman then decides to help them, and they rescue what they realize is Supergirl from a giant scrotum and make for the Batcave, where Supergirl helps Barry get struck by lightning again, which is a thing that he tried in Flashpoint, but this time it goes substantially better for the comic, or the film Barry Allen, who gets his powers back, and the crew goes to fight Zod. After a slow-motion joke by Barry, which I can only assume is a dig at Zack Snyder or an acknowledgement that he likes to use slow-mo, the newly formed Justice League fails to stop Zod, leading to the death of Batman and Supergirl repeatedly. The two Barrys try to go back in time, but consistently find out that their best efforts to save that world are met with absolute failure. Younger Barry gradually and predictably turns into the time monster Flash that we saw at the beginning, with the effects of his repeated messing with time resulting in a collision of all of the on-screen DC universes, including Christopher Reeves and George Reeves, and also from the unproduced 1997 Superman Lives, Nicolas Cage Superman fighting a Thanagarian death beast. Yes, that's what they were going to call the Spider, and yes, per Kevin Smith's real script draft, that was absolutely going to happen and didn't. The world is seemingly set right as Barry makes the choice to say goodbye to his mother in a scene that was actually pretty touching, but also weird because, again, where do you get organic tomatoes in a regular grocery store in 2003? And two, I don't think that she'd have hugged some random stranger in a store, but okay. Barry puts the tomatoes on the top shelf so his dad has to look up directly into the security camera, but Barry does not think to go and find out who stabbed his mom. Anyway, his dad is exonerated, and on the steps of the courthouse, Bruce Wayne pulls up, and now it's George Clooney Batman. I really kind of wanted it to be Pattinson, but I'm sort of glad that it isn't, because that means that this movie is not in that continuity, and it ends with a post-credit scene with Aquaman, a movie that nobody is probably that excited about to have happen either, which is kind of a bummer. How could you be? Warner Brothers has basically made it ultra clear that there are no stakes here in this movie or in Aquaman or maybe even in Blue Beetle because of the upcoming Gunn reset, who, by the way, had really nothing to do with this other than being their spokesman and saying that it was a great movie when it actually wasn't. So, but before we get into that last part, let me drill down pros and cons. Pros, performances. Michael Keaton was great. Ezra Miller was surprisingly tolerable, more so than they have been in any other movie that I've seen. Keaton and Miller pretty well held together a movie that I wasn't really interested in seeing and had low expectations of, and still ended up being fairly entertained by. Fight choreography, Keaton Batman specifically felt pretty awesome to watch. And it was kind of neat seeing almost looked like a Kingdom Come bat suit in the background as well. That said, Easter eggs were pretty cool, and they did their best to adapt a Flashpoint story as closely as they could with the characters that they actually had. The cons, the CGI. Shit was straight out of Xbox 360. What is happening here? It was sometimes great. The suits looked good, for example, pretty frequently, but then when it wasn't great, man, it was very bad. A lot of Sasha Calle's movements in fighting looked very weird and unnatural. Also, she seemed to be completely useless. Why even introduce her as a separate Supergirl in a separate universe anyway? There was no reason to not do a frail, skinny CGI Superman of Henry Cavill. Speaking of which, Henry Cavill's CGI brief appearance also looked like he was a Skyrim forge worker who was trying to fight you for stealing iron. The Easter eggs also had the dual effect of sucking because these are just nostalgia from old movies that Warner had done much, much better when they ruled comic book movies. And they adapted a story that the Arrowverse had somehow managed to do a little bit better in a few ways, so 6.5 to 7 out of 10 is pretty much where I'm at, which is not complimentary. It was merely fine, but I say that expecting it to have been a 4 out of 10, which it wasn't for me. But we also got to talk about Ezra Miller, because it's not simply that it's obvious that Ezra Miller is not well. They're on film assaulting people, brandishing guns, using drugs. The last two, you know, whatever, I'm not necessarily against, but also like this person isn't a rapper. They're a 30-year-old actor who has a history of breaking and entering, assault, and is provably a groomer. Their partner, Takata Iron Eyes, has been groomed since around the age of 12. And even then, a 30-year-old with an 18-year-old is a super questionable age difference, maybe not as much in Hollywood, but still, Bottom line, despite drug addiction and mental health issues, Ezra Miller is responsible for the harm that they caused and must be held to account for it and should not be protected by Warner Brothers' money. They should have been held to account far earlier than this movie coming out. If we're going to talk about recasting Jonathan Majors as Kang, like, if he's guilty of that, that's appropriate. That makes total sense. Keep that same energy with Ezra Miller, though. Mental health issues and addiction may explain harmful behavior, but they do not excuse someone from the consequences that their behavior causes. It also does not help that Ezra gets brought up by regressive chuds as an example of the broader groomer blood libel of their current anti-LGBTQ, anti-woke new propagandist fascists whose channels and podcasts you are already familiar with, and I am not going to bother mentioning them, but all of their heads look like different pieces of soggy fruit, and frankly, that is yet another good reason why Miller should get actual prison time and not be shielded by their profile as an actor in one of the costliest boondoggles in film history. A movie with a lead so off-putting and so troubled that even the first and best Batman on screen simply couldn't save it. Thanks everybody for watching. This has been the Doomcast. We'll see you next week.